Right.
So how do you guys want to go about the conversation from here? I know this is a little bit more free-flowing. Like, what topics of interest do you really want to talk about? Go for it.
So one of the slides that I guess you had on your slide deck originally
That I took out, but yeah.
This round, and Banning had in his, was interesting because a couple of us are from kind of the private sector entrepreneurs, and what's interesting is the cell phone. I think people's perception is that the cell phone, and at least it was my perception, the cell phone was invented by the private sector. And it was interesting when you guys, I wasn't familiar with the fact that a lot of the key technologies, 12 of the technologies,
95% of the phone,
all government funded.
Yeah, I had the slide. So I had a slide in my previous deck.
How can you make that stuff available to the private sector, so the private sector, so that we can take that stuff out and actually make the cell phones of the future, whatever that may be?
Well, I think that's part of it. So with the SBI, so what's interesting about that is that the mobile phone, the smartphone, about 70% of the components that make it up were driven by small business innovation research grant and contract funding opportunities back in the day. And so that's where the government plays that role of, well, how many of you are familiar with the fact that if you win an SBIR award and you do the research and develop the technology, that you keep the IP? The government does not keep it. Okay, so a couple of you are familiar with that. So you keep the IP and we don't take an equity stake. You keep the money. You just tell us what you did. You take the patents, whatever it is, we expect you to commercialize. And so that's, I think the thing is, you're asking is how does the private sector jump into that? From the SBIR perspective, our answer to that is that we're asking you to solve those problems. We're asking you to solve that technology, and we're expecting you to figure out how to commercialize it, but we'll give you the funding to do that necessary research and development so that you get that prototype built out, and then you can go to market and say, look, I've got this amazing widget, go for it.
Now, I personally am kind of pessimistic because, so remember, World War II, the United States is pretty much the only country still standing after World War II, which is an artificiality that hopefully we will not replicate in the near future. But we were spending 80% of R&D investment was coming from government.
Right.
Only 20% was coming from industry, and that's now flipped. Now R&D dollars is 80% private sector, 20% government, and in fact, if you look at what private sector is spending it on, it's not R. It is D, because nobody wants to be Xerox PARC. And so nobody wants to take that big bet on something that may play out in 10 years or 15 years. That is a government thing, but at the same time, we've got tightening taxes and tightening fiscal conditions, and we've got no one advocating on the private sector side saying, I want the government to do more of the big research projects. And so I worry that we're riding this cusp of innovation that came because of those investments in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And we're not going to have anything else other than maybe quantum, and even then quantum's coming from the private sector and it's coming from other places other than the United States.
And maybe we made a big mistake in not requiring these companies, when they commercialize and make a profit, they either give some percentage, maybe it's 0.5% of their profits, or pay some equity. We would be refunding all that research we should have done. I mean, and then you have Apple running around that has the 12 key technologies, all from government funded research, from GPS to smart, to the screen, to everything, right? And they don't even want to pay taxes, right? They offshore $250 billion and don't want to pay tax, much less pay royalties or anything else. And maybe we have not kept the ecosystem going because we've let them do things. I mean, obviously, if they don't commercialize, you don't expect any money back, right? But if they're making big money, maybe there should be a little tiny piece that would add up to a lot of money to fund more research.
So it's funny because you make some valid points, and I think one of the things the original intent for the SBIR program, I guess, at the end of the day was that money would be recouped back through taxes. I mean, so Qualcomm and Biogen, IDIC employed thousands upon thousands of people. They have meaningful jobs. They develop next generation technology, and oh, by the way, they're paying their taxes, and so that gets fueled back in, indirectly into what it is we do. I don't know. That's an issue that our elected officials at the House Small Business Committee.
That's what David said. No, it's not the 80%. It's the 20%.
Right.
Well, the challenge you have is globalization. Nobody. So I always believe that past successes will set yourselves up for future failures. So example number one. Congratulations, United States. You have a high standard of living. Challenge. Now it's hard for your workers to compete overseas because of the salaries that are expected.
Right.
Congratulations, United States, you've connected to the rest of the world the internet. Challenge, you've connected to the rest of the world the internet. And so policymakers do not think second and third and fourth order effects, partly because, again, our election cycle is either 2 years or 4 years. You're not rewarded for having the 10-year or 15-year plan. Singapore, every 10 years, does a 50-year plan. Can you imagine doing a 50-year plan, let alone a 10-year plan on what we want to do in the United States? Now, in some respects, that actually allows us to have our freedoms. I mean, if you go back to the founders, they wanted checks and balances. James Madison said in 1788, "What is government but the greatest reflection of humanity? If all men and women were angels, no government would be necessary." So they recognize that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But at the same time, the question is, if we're on this exponential curve and we have policymakers that are being elected that have short-term thinking, and that's part of the election process, it then falls on the shoulders of nonpartisan people like Nagesh and I, which generally most of our peers were not recruited for that. The promise was you do 30 or 40 years, you get a nice pension at the end, you don't rock the boat. I don't think either of us plan we're going to be here 30 or 40 years to do the same job.
Right.
But the whole reward cycle is not geared to rewarding those who are nonpartisan individuals to be those risk takers. Because again, you're not going to get an IPO. I mean, we're just doing it because we care, but otherwise.
Well, yeah, because people are driven by love, pride, money, and fear, and we're doing it really more out of love.
Out of love, yeah.
So that gets a little difficult.
But I mean, it's a public conversation that needs to happen, as well as the myth busting that somehow innovation comes from the ad companies that are billion-dollar revenues on the West Coast.
And it gets interesting too, because you talked about the election term cycle and everyone's just pandering on that front. But if you look at the corporate cycle, they're playing it off the quarterlies. And so that's what's become issue. You know, my boss, John Williams, and I talk about this when we did an event up at MIT back in October. We got kind of annoyed at the fact that, you know, the AT&T, Bell Labs, you know, the Xerox parks, those have gone away. They're not doing that critical R&D that needed to be done. And so that's where it's like, okay, so how do we, the federal government, empower that next base of folks who are willing to do the R, the true R, but when it's early basic research and not at the university stuff, because that's that's all gimmicks and stuff, to be honest, not to knock on that, but it's having that notion of applied. Having that notion of critical applied research when you're doing it, because the basic's interesting and cute, but you're just learning. It's the applied that matters, because then you're truly trying to solve a problem, and that's what's going to rationalize it and catalyze into something that's transformative.
300%.
I'm curious about your perspective on IP in the future and the patent as a concept, because exponential times maybe the whole value of IP and the mechanism of protection and this staticity of like 20 years. I mean, how is this going to change? Is it going to change? Should it change? And what would you think it should happen?
So I used to practice patent law. I was a patent examiner at the patent office, so I've paid my dues in that world. It's funny because that's a property right. It's an asset. It's a property right for assets. And it's a property right driven on this notion that you would be recouped for your R&D to have a limited term monopoly. And what's happened is that you've had a bit of a practice of the perversion around the extension and the use of these various mechanisms to extend your monopoly for a longer term than needed. I mean, the founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution, included that clause that denoted the protection for the promotion of the useful arts and sciences. You know, they were very clear. It's like, sure, you can get some protection for disclosing your secret and, you know, make a little bit of money, recoup your costs, but that's it, because it's for the general public's good to benefit from that. That was the original thesis. And what's happened is that we've got these new parties in play who've basically try to take that and control it and say, well, let's extend it as long as we can so that we can squeeze every penny out of everyone possible. And it's not fair. I think it's unfortunate. But I also think with the onslaught, and I'm a big patent advocate in the sense of, like, I understand its usefulness and I appreciate what it means as a property right. I'm not a fan of how it's being abused. And that's the distinction. With that said, because I think independent inventors need to be protected. They need to know that they have something that they can leverage to build their successful company forward. With that said, I will say this. I think with the world of the digital economy, I think the world of the Internet of Things coming online, I think the fact that 3D printing is becoming more and more of a reality, that is going to be a very hard property law to enforce adequately. And so we probably will have to think about in the next 10, 15, 20 years from now, how to rethink that legal system for here and or abroad as well.
There is a solution?
I don't think there is a solution yet, and I think that's partially driven to what the courts decide to do. I think that's partially driven to what the lawmakers decide to do, and I think that's partially driven to what the innovators decide they want to do. It is a very divided notion of thinking, and it's partially different because you've got those in the digital world who see patents in one way and those in the physical world who see patents in another way. If you ever saw how AIA and all that stuff was going out, it was the bio firms, the manufacturing firms who looked at IP in one way, and you saw the software companies that saw IP in a different way. And so it's going to change over time, and patent attorneys are going to have to get used to the changes down the road.
So I'm even more pessimistic and say that train wreck is already happening because we don't have any consistency for IP laws across national borders. And so already with the internet, if you don't like one country's IP law or things like that, you go to another country and you just basically say, I'm going to build it there. And now with 3D manufacturing, it's only going to get worse. I think this is a lot like Napster, when people said, well, thou shalt not share MP3 files, and it required the industry to innovate and make money in other ways, both through live shows and then also providing a mechanism that was, okay, I'm not willing to pay $3 a song, but I'm willing to pay 99 cents or things like that, or I'll do music as a subscription. And so just like that, we're going to have to innovate with IP law and say maybe it's first mover's advantage. And so really it's not about trying to keep things secret. I mean, Uber, there's nothing that prevents you from trying to do another Uber. In fact, we know there are other ones that are doing it. But their advantage is they got there first. And so there may be things like that too, that it's not about necessarily keeping something secret, just get there first. It may also be recognition that there's going to be the collision with what Europe is doing with GDPR. So for those who don't know, it right now is illegal in Europe, and it's going to be tested soon, to make an autonomous decision without disclosing how you made the decision. And this is thinking about privacy, and there's actually some good in it. But this is running headlong into intellectual property. Because if you have to disclose how you made the decision, you can imagine Google and Facebook are probably like, do we really want to show how we made our search rank recommendations and why that page showed up there and things like that? And so Europe is going to be the interesting battleground in the next year between the balance of interesting privacy and intellectual property that's going to play itself out in the digital era. And I actually think the nation state is going to go away. That's me. But anyway, we'll come back to you, Bill, just to try and get a few other people. I think you had your hand up first.
I think that we are here kind of all innovation zealots.
Yes.
And it's like in a religious convention. Everybody believes in the tenets of the religion. We forget that there is a great imbalance. The lion's share of humanity is not with us. Everybody's using a cell phone. But for most people, it's a mystery. And we created a situation the same way as in the past there was a small elite that got all the money in the world and everybody was the slaves. We have now the elite not of money but of knowledge. And there is a precious few who are really into the technology and can make it work, and the rest are dependent. When we are trying to hire solid programmers, we cannot find them. We cannot find them. We get all those resumes. It's very difficult because they are so scarce. And it's getting worse and worse. And so we are facing a situation with AI that the jobs will be gone. We need to rethink society. You know, what Romney said in 2012, 47% getting government subsidies, this will be 97%. And 3% will be the AI that will replace all those jobs. So someone has to think beyond the technology We need to bring some philosophers here.
Oh,
People
I can
who will
go
think
into
the whole
Rawls
idea.
and Mills with you, and in fact, I am quite skeptical, and that's partly why I continue to serve in public service as opposed to a tech company.
And I would say, I'm teaching University of Maryland, I have students who, if they're telling me, if I have a free time, I will not read a history book, I read a tech book. Because
Ooh,
that's what I need
scary.
to compete. So I have the smartest guy in the world that can solve all those algorithms, and they say, the Civil War, French, the Chinese, who fought? No idea.
Oh, yeah.
So we have a big problem that we need to recognize as we get so excited about where the front is. What happened with the rest? To look back and say we need to find a way to bring.
So interestingly enough, actually, while I agree with you, we need to think about the rest, it is actually not as bad as it sounds. 2001, less than 2% of households on the face of the planet had a cell phone. According to ITU, any guesses what the percentage is now globally? Households?
Yeah.
99%. Households.
Well,
And recognizing, so, I mean, I agree, there's still education,
more people on
and
the
there's
face of
things.
the earth have cell phone than people who have toilet.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the reality.
Yeah, I know, and so it doesn't mean necessarily that technology uplifts people's lives. And in fact, in some cases, it allows extortion rackets in certain parts of Africa. But I think it's recognizing that there are certain things that now can be delivered that weren't possible in the past, which is education through that medium. And so I think...
That's what we have to emphasize.
Yes.
I agree with you.
So I think that conversation needs to be had. The question is to what's the social contract to provide that. It's not just having within one National Geographic, that we need to recognize that what affects one part of the world will affect us all. I mean, I come from public health. My background was actually bioterrorism preparedness, and I always say infectious diseases do not stop at national borders. And so we have a social responsibility. That said, I do worry, actually I worry even more here, that we may be creating a whole approach to neo-feudalism without realizing it.
That's what I'm saying.
That with the sharing economy, which I celebrate, a lot of those jobs will be automated probably in the next 6 years. And then what are they going to do?
Think economics, social sciences, we need to think about it not just from the technology, because we get all excited about technology, faster, better, algorithms, but there is a bigger world out there.
Oh yeah, well, and I think that's the unique thing that DC brings. I mean, I love the West Coast and I love other parts of the world, but DC does have those conversations. And in fact, I'll go to, so Rousseau actually said that democracy is a corrupt regime because it only encourages self-interest. What you really want is a plurality, which is all the virtues of a democracy, plus thinking about the good of the community. And that you don't need everyone in a plurality to think about the good. In fact, you only need about 20%. And it's interesting, he said that in the 1700s. So he had the 80-20 rule before it was actually documented. But then he was pessimistic that you still wouldn't find that 20% that would think about the good of the community. But I raise that as to, yes, what is our place where we are rewarding those that think about the good of the community sans politics? And if we don't have that, if instead it's seen that, well, why did you ever go into government? Because that's a place that, it's a dead end. And it doesn't have to be just government. It can be academic places. It can be nonprofits. If we're not having that community conversation, then yes, we will go off that cliff.
Well, you quote a quote that I really object to, which is that if men and women were angels, we wouldn't need
That was
government.
me.
Oh,
blame
you
me.
say that?
Yes.
Okay. I really object to that because we need government for other reasons, not just to keep people from doing bad things, or because we need government to
Oh,
be
but see,
big
you're interpreting that
cooperation.
as a sign that it's just about bad things. It's just saying that should we not expect the process of doing public service to be human in its endeavors? So, for example, how many of you know that the former head of DARPA X, Google X, their version of DARPA, 3 years ago overdosed on heroin in the presence of a prostitute and died? Some of you might know about it because we follow the sectors, but most people don't. Had that happened in government, we probably would have had about 12 months of congressional hearings. I think we'd all there had been a no prostitute waiver that you have to sign when you come in and things like that.
All of a sudden, travel budgets would be cut across. Because you saw what happened with
They
GSA.
already were.
Well, yeah, no, but like the situation what happened with GSA
Yeah.
from years ago. And then all of a sudden we all paid that price. And then Las Vegas all of a sudden was off limits for any government official for a while. And with CES and CTA occurring at that time, all of a sudden no government official would dare want to go to that conference, although it was a great conference and a great network of folks, just because of the appearance of, oh, we're at this conference in Vegas. Oh, GSA thing again. Sorry, I know this is on camera, but.
What I think you're saying is that, yes, it's not just about preventing people from doing bad things, but it's recognizing that the process of providing public service is a very human endeavor to begin with.
Right.
Henry Ford said that 20% of the people in his company did 80% of the valuable work, and that was a private company. Why should we not be surprised that the same thing is true for other organizations as well? And so it's almost like we try to uphold a higher standard, and maybe we should. I think we should expect that. But it creates this false perception that somehow the private sector, and that, how often do I see government should be more like a business? I definitely don't see the other way around. And so it's an interesting conversation that is a lost conversation in some ways.
I wanted to just dovetail on something you said that was interesting. Is our current system around the world is driven on supply and demand. And so the question is what are we supplying next?
Right.
Right now it's a variety of things. But and it's driven on the supply and demand because it's driven on finite resources. But the universe is infinite. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do you unlock that infinite equation so that you get rid of supply and demand? And then all of a sudden you work off this new cultural model of engagement. I mean, and it's this, I think it's talked about at SU, it's like this notion of a Star Trek universe. That's going to happen down the road. As to when and how and where, that's up to us as to when we wish to enable that cultural adoption to occur. But that's also driven on the fact of when we move forward from this utilitarian thinking of what it is we do and what it is we are to exhibit.
I mean, I hope the Star Trek universe happens.
Done.
One thing I worry about it is, one, it never changed in the entire 5 years of the season.
No, it
And then two, and I don't want to be too pessimistic, but this gets to your point. So evolution is a blind watchmaker. How many people know the story of the hermit crab? Hermit crabs, evolution and selectionary pressures were such that female hermit crabs pick male hermit crabs on the size of their claw. The larger the claw, the more likely the females to pick the hermit crab, because it's a better defense against predators. Play that out over millions of years, you now have a case where male hermit crabs have claws so large they cannot run away from predators. So, evolution is a blind watchmaker. Intelligence has allowed us to get to almost every part of the planet. But intelligence also allows us to build weapons of mass destruction. And so I hope we can recognize that humans, and that's where I go back to that quote, is that human beings are flawed, and that's okay. That's part of what makes us beautiful. Yeah. But the question is, what's changing is the technology. What's not changing is the humanness that makes us human. And so how can we figure out systems that allow us, that are not autocratic, to recognize humans are flawed and still move together as a species?
Just a couple comments. And, my name is Irakli Berit. I'm heading a UN program on artificial intelligence and robotics, and we're just launching a first United Nations Center on AI and robotics, which will be based in The Hague, the Netherlands, and that's like first UN efforts in that sense. So we fully share some of the issues you're bringing up and you're bringing up as well, and that's what the center will be also discussing and sort of tackling, bringing in all the possible stakeholders from the private sector, government, academia, and others to have these discussions taking place and coming up with some kind of recommendations or possible solutions. Of course, there is no blueprint right now, so you cannot just have a readily made solution on what will happen with the employment and how this automation is going to basically disrupt a lot of things and what will be the solutions. But what we will be looking at is a lot of input from people like yourself and others to have these international discussions, and I really agree with you that yes, these issues don't have borders, so there has to be a global solutions rather than like one-country solutions or national solutions there as well. So not yet. This was just a comment, not.
Well, thanks for having us. We're glad you're here. The one thing I will also say on the comment that people may not know this, but I think it's worth getting out there. Of the countries involved with the supposed Arab awakening that occurred, all except for Tunisia are now worse off than they were prior to the Arab Awakening. And so I raise that because it's worth thinking about, had the Berlin Wall fallen not in 1989, but fallen in 2009, would we have had as peaceful a transition over the next 2 years to adopt Western democracy in the former Soviet republics? I celebrate that the internet makes us more open and transparent, but it also makes it easier to target misinformation, as we know, fake news nowadays, to people that are susceptible to becoming true believers. And then once you get them recruited as a true believer, you can then connect them to 300, 3,000 people. And if they see 3,000 people that are all thinking the same thing, they must be right. And so I raise that because the internet, again, is amoral, and we have people that somehow think it's only a force for good. And I'm like, look at what happened with the Arab Awakening and what was robbed of them. And even Tunisia actually is now on a downward slide, pro the World Bank. And so we need to recognize that this is a double-edged sword, and we need to think of new solutions that recognize it's not the technology that necessarily needs to change, it's just how you bring in the human nodes to lead to better outcomes as opposed to worse outcomes.
Yeah.
I have a quick question, just about kind of the focus of all this. Like you're saying just then, it's not the technology that needs to change. And we talk about, the 20% and the 80%. I find, this group, it seems, is really focused on enriching the abilities of that 20%, finding the next new tool instead of leveraging the tools that exist and bringing that 80% up to speed to an extent. Do you feel that that is a negative impact or is a true statement?
I think we need both. I think we need both making sure, I advocate always, I'll show my philosophy. I'm a Rawlsian. I believe in the moment we're born into this world, we have biases, whether we're male, female, white, black, whatever our race is, whether we're born into affluence or not. And so that determines our version of justice. And unfortunately, that's a biased version of justice. And so Rawls would say you have to wear the veil of ignorance. You don't know who you're going to be in the world yet. And essentially, what would you agree to as fair? And it's a thought experiment, but he argues, basically, you'd agree to, in any situation, those that are the worse off are the best off of all possible scenarios. So when you're making this, so the trouble with utilitarianism is you could justify and say, I'm going to enslave 10% or 1% if the rest are really good off. But what Rawls is saying is, no, there's going to be trade-offs, and you're never going to have perfect equity. But for whatever situation, make sure you're bringing up the bottom as best you can for the good of the all. And I raise that just because we don't know who we're going to be. So I think you need to have both. You need to have those pioneers that are thinking beyond what we're currently doing, because what we're currently doing is not perfect. But at the same time, not waiting for perfect to make sure you bring along everyone else too.
I'd probably echo all of that and just say that you have to enable access to opportunity. You have to enable access to that point to be able to jump off. People write their own future from there. But if they have the tools there to empower them and be able to make the best informed decision and be able to grow from that, then you've done your job.
But what are you going to do for the Luddites?
Well, that's a great question, because there actually may also be not just Luddites. There may very well be, if every action is an equal and opposite reaction every 10 years or so,
Yeah.
there may be a very anti-tech movement that emerges in 2020. You're already seeing
Anti-globalization.
Yeah, that and anti-email, that email consumes too much of people's time. There are people, that's the movement towards Slack and things like that. And so technology is not necessarily delivering on all these things that Eric Schmidt and others promised it was going to do in the books that were written. And so there may be an anti-technology movement that says this has not made our lives better. It's made it more complicated and created more headaches. And so you always will have late adopters. I think you hug them as closely as you can and listen to them and try to be as empathic as possible.
Well, when you talk about that too, I think of a conversation a lot that I've been having. So my wife works in disability rights advocacy, and it's this notion of acceptance. So there's this culture, especially amongst technologists, and we come up with these technology solutions, and I've been seeing it a lot with our NIH, SBIR, and NSF, SBIR funded technologies, and even from the defense of this ableistic approach of the technology empowering and someone with disabilities to be more able function. And perhaps that's not the appropriate thing. And as she's convinced me, is that people want to celebrate their differences. People want to be able to celebrate who it is and what they are. That it's there to assist, but that's what it is, an assisted device, not meant to make them feel like it's this ableistic and whatnot. And so that's that thing we have to be cognizant of that. We're seeking to develop these solutions for those who wish to be able to adopt them, but not alienate them. Is that a good way of saying it?
We're probably gonna have to wrap up here because I know that there's space for a little bit
Oh, yeah.
longer. Yeah,
A few more questions.
what time?
We can not go for another 15 or 20 minutes. We need the clean crews coming in later tonight, but we can go until 7:30.
Force us out when you need to force us out. Had the big
Yeah,
book come
and-
out
and-
and go,
Listening, let's put it down.
But I also, listen, the philosophical conversations are fantastic, but, you know, it's, the education of this piece, I mean, I speak in front of, in schools and kids, and my kids come to me and say, you're just a nerd, Dad.
Welcome.
They're right, I'm just a nerd. But I tell them, I said, someone has to program that driverless car to make a decision whether it's gonna hit the dog in front of it or hit the 3 people on the sidewalk. And that has to be a human being programming that. And there's a legal aspect, which is employing lawyers. There's a program, someone's got to code it, and someone's got to make the philosophical decision about it, about understanding the philosophical debate about what's going to happen. So I think we're covering just the tech part of this, but my son plays for an all-Hispanic soccer team. And we put him on the team. He chose to be on the team because it's the best team in the state of Maryland. And he made the team. He's the only white kid in the team. And he said, you know, I was on the sideline with the parents. They're all first generation immigrants, barely speak English. And kid comes up to me, one of the kids, and says, yeah, I was in Montgomery College, junior college, and I just left. And I said, why are you leaving? And he goes, oh, well, because I want to make some money. And he goes, and I said, where are you going to make your money? Because I want to make money working at Walmart and at 7-Eleven. And I'm going to go to school part-time. I said, no, you're not. I said, you're going to be exhausted standing on your feet all day long. And I know my customers are Albin Tractor. Like, we're not getting rid of heavy equipment. We're not getting rid of these fancy cars that have embedded computer systems. You know, my Suburban has more electronics on it than a lunar mission. So I said to him, well, what do you like? Do you like using your hands? And he goes, yeah, I love using my hands. And I said, well, why don't you go get an internship with Albin Tractor? And they have old farts that they can't train, keep pace with the technology. Now there's all IoT devices, embedded sensors. They're basically just huge, gargantuan computers. And they need young kids to come in that are computer savvy, can plug in, not afraid to get hands dirty and greasy. There's so many jobs out there for kids that are trained in how to do tech. But they don't have to do tech. They might want to just play. They might just want to work with earth-moving equipment or motorcycles, or everything's computerized. So as far as lifting people up, I think this is largely going to play itself out. I think robots are going to. I think we're going to have assistants. We're not. I said to my kids, I said, you're not smarter than your phone. Your phone is smarter than you. Why do you need to know finding a civilization? Just plug it in. You got your answer. But how do you synthesize data across many domains? How do you work in teams? How do you work here at Market Design? You can't just be a smart individual. You got to work as a team.
What happens when the battery dies? You're stupid.
So anyway, I love the philosophical debate. I have guys on my podcast that are philosophy major. They write books on philosophy and the intersection of AI and philosophy. But I think the reality is, I mean, people need jobs. And I said to this kid, you're going to be about 21 years old. You're going to make $75,000 a year. I said, you realize that half of the people who are going to college are going to come out with $200,000 in debt, not making raw cash $75,000 a year. I said, that's money in your pocket. And I think there's a grounding in reality that we need about this whole conversation. Not for this conversation, but the whole, you know, we can get spiraled up on all the cool tech, and forget, you know, we got to drive a car. Most of us are going to have to drive a car for the next 20 years.
So I think that points to, I feel like the last 8 years, there's been a dialogue between the West Coast and the East Coast, which sometimes wasn't always occurring. It was just a West Coast dialogue or just an East Coast dialogue. But I think we need to have it be a whole nation dialogue, and that's not happened.
One general question for you. What do you say about those who claim that we are hyping it? That if you have now technology that somebody 20 years ago forecasted, this is linear development, this is not new. That we don't have some fundamental new things like quantum physics, like
I
relativity,
think we have quantum,
like
yeah.
DNA, that really change things dramatically. That we have everything that we have, we celebrate with such noise that it looks like, oh, we rediscovered America. But there is a lot of hype, and we must ask ourselves, why don't we find more theory of relativity? Something really profound that comes out of left field, that nobody projected, and then we know that we have
Well, I
really
think,
invented.
so that's great. I think I would agree with you 100%. I mean, when I said it's all about D, it's not about R. That doesn't mean there's still a massive change. And I think what I would say, it's not just that someone predicted it 20 years ago, it's that the technology adoption curves are getting smaller and smaller and larger in scope. Nobody is right now investing in anything that's groundbreaking other than quantum, and with some bio, and so.
What about things like CRISPR? I mean, we can edit DNA down to
True.
base pair.
That's what I'm saying, the bio space.
The government's
Even then,
investing in some of that, but it's not enough. It's
No.
very,
It's not
it's
enough
pennies
because the
compared to
percentage
what
of
could
money-
be. Yeah.
And even then, CRISPR was a bit of an accident. I mean, that was something
Yeah.
that nature already had. We didn't design CRISPR.
Edison could afford to tinker and invent his valve. Today, to do an equivalent, we have to come to you and get all this investment when we have something that we cannot prove, that it's just our imagination.
But
Well,
even
it's-
then, he's only going to do applied. I mean, so
Yeah.
I think the challenge is nobody wants to do Xerox PARC.
Yeah.
Right?
The lesson was learned. You invest in things that don't lead to ends, and everyone else is more than happy to take your ideas. And so,
On the CRISPR thing too, I think this dovetails into what David was talking about fake news and misinformation. How many are familiar with Andrew Hessel? Okay, so he and I are friends as well. And so Andrew, so you're familiar with that story that came out in the New York Times a few months ago?
why don't you tell everyone? Yeah.
It was horseshit, is what that was. That's what that was. And it was funny because when it broke out, I pinged him and I said, dude, this is not true. And he goes, no. And our friend. So the story is that there was this claim in the New York Times that this bio enclave of folks, leaders, were having a little mini cabal of the sort, private meeting of how they were going to enable this next generation of CRISPR gene editing and related technologies forward. And they were doing it in secrecy and seclusion rather than in this open, discussion environment. And that really wasn't the case. It was just more of a discussion of like what they could do to help figure stuff out. And they would have the open dialogue down the road. It was just more about like what do the trends need to be. And so the story got spun in this way of like not this open science, but this closed science kind of perspective. And it was just a massive disservice. It was just someone who was just trying to create some unnecessary buzz. And when that broke out, I pinged Andrew, and he was like, yeah, and I felt bad for him. And then, our mutual friend Yolanda was like, I was there. That was not what was happening. So I trust them.
Now, I do want to circle back to your question, though, is nobody doing the big thoughts? It's worth noting that Lord Kelvin said in 1890 that all inventions had pretty much been done as of 1890.
Oh, yeah.
And then it was a postal worker that was actually failing at his job that discovered some of the things that later was Einstein. And so you don't necessarily need a big budget to come up with big breakthroughs. And who knows what's out there. You just have to question different than the status quo.
Yeah.
And so I think that's still possible nowadays, too.
So given exponential, sorry if you already covered this, I came in a little bit late, but given exponential trends and talking about lots of funding and R&D, what are your opinions, what are your thoughts on the exponential trend of governmental debt? And how does that play out? Because, if we can't pay off our debts, and then on top of that, how does blockchain or the decentralization of money play out?
We drop the dollar, we shift to Bitcoin.
So, let's use a illicit currency to pay off our debt. That would work well. So, the interesting thing about debt, there actually is a solution that's happening right now that may not be intentional, but it's happening right now, and it's called inflation. So, congrats, you have, X number of dollars in debt, but the dollar
See what
has
happened to Germany with inflation.
So if you look at what's happened, I mean, countries have printed huge amounts with this quantitative easing and other things like that, but the inflation has not occurred yet, and the question is why? Is it that it's mutually assured that everyone is printing more dollars around, but
Where did it go?
Yeah.
What rose? Asset prices and
right.
other
So
things.
that's interesting questions to be asked. It may also be that the future is there will always be global politics and there will always be local politics, but the question is, are nations just simply middlemen that don't really matter going forward? And I worry about that though, because if we go to a future in which everything is local and then there's global, there will be eventually enough locals that band together that say we're now going to beat up and bully all the other locals, and then you've got a problem. But it's worth noting, yes, that the printing press that we talked about earlier predated the Treaty of Westphalia by 200 years. The internet, very much like the printing press, will probably give rise to new ways of organizing, and that's where we do have to have the conversation of, I hope it's not corporations, but you could imagine a large corporation saying they want to have diplomatic immunity from a small country in Europe.
or
Well,
decentralized,
it's
not
cities,
times.
cities.
Decentralized organizations or
Decentralization, but again, that only works if we all decentralize, other than the large nation state says, thank you very much for decentralizing, by the way, I'm not going to take you over. Which is what Larry Page, when he wanted to put his barges in international waters and claim Google servers were no longer in the United States, I talked to him, I said, that's great, and then China says they need to do an inspection. Who are you calling then? So decentralization is great and ideal until the larger bully comes up, and so I do think there will be local communities, and maybe that's where the power goes more, and that nation states have to have that negotiation. Decentralization also makes me worry because that's what neo-feudalism was. I mean, that's what feudalism was, and so that you're going to have people with large amounts of capital with no estate tax, and they carry it over with legacies. And if the future is all automation, then it's all about the ability to be the first to invest the capital in the automation, and the rest of us aren't working. And so there are some interesting futures. I think we just have to have conversations about where do we want to go.
Karl Marx started decentralization. He called it communism,
We did.
and we know where it gets.
Yes, it was a great theory, but then you put humans in the
Yeah.
mix, and unfortunately, they don't make it as
Paper communism sounds the most,
Decentralization and
the most
communism.
justice.
I don't know about that. Are decentralization and communism the same?
Yeah, the same thing. It's just, no hierarchy, no rich and poor, the proletariat,
That's
the
Stalin.
network, but
Early Marx, yeah, not Stalin. Stalin's version was a little different.
And the excitement that they had in the middle of the 19th century rivals the excitement that people have today about the Bitcoin. And so, a lot of question marks.
Well, the Bitcoin, I think, is going to come and go. I think that is going to be, 20 years from now, we're going to look and say, I said
That was a cute fad.
I'm going to say it's going to be like that, if you remember Pets.com, the Super Bowl ad with the sock puppet, that is what Bitcoin's going to be 20 years from now.
The same way about blockchain generally, or specifically?
So the blockchain with a capital T and a capital B, that just doesn't scale. But peer-to-peer blockchain-like technologies, those could be interesting. You just have to solve some problems, which is one, storage capacity, how long are you storing as these things grow and grow and grow? How many people are you sharing them with? And the computation and the energy requirements if it truly is distributed to the entire world. I mean, let's face it, the blockchain with a capital T, capital B was done for a small group of people that wanted to share currency illicitly with no attribution. I'm not sure that's what we as an entire planet want to do.
Is it, I mean, it could be it's the internet of money, right? So we now have an internet of finance.
But do you really want, if 50% corner the market to basically reassert the contracts that you've negotiated? I mean, again,
It's worthless.
that's what I'm saying.
So
Yeah,
the
so,
incentives are that it would
I mean,
not
but that's why the
gather
blockchain was
resources
developed, was for that purpose of not for, and so I see there's interesting things in peer-to-peer and sharding. I've actually already seen where you can do entirely end-to-end encrypted computing on people's computers that are completely decentralized and you never know what's being processed where. That's kind of interesting. You can also store data in an entire 100% encrypted form, and so you never know where your data is actually being stored and what country it's being stored in. So I think there's some interesting things. If you really wanted to be a disruptive play on the internet of money, I would come out and say, money is data and data is money. Let's face it, Google already recognizes that. That's why they give you so many free things. And so do the Swiss bank play, which says if you want to store your data or your money with us, you have a choice. It can either be for a service where you pay us, in which case we're not going to sell your data to anybody, Or you have a sliding scale as to how much data is given up, and that in turn gets your services for free. But on top of it, if you really want to be a disruptive regulatory play, say we offer you a service that in 20 minutes or less, we will move your PKI, your public key, to any nation in the world at your choice. So if your data is encrypted and your money is encrypted, but the key is being moved to different countries, which now would say you're probably underneath their rules for data and money, that's an interesting disruptive play.
Especially when tax season comes.
Yes.
Well, like Estonia, you can start a business in Estonia without ever going.
Well, and so Estonia is a wonderful example. For those who do not know, Estonia, of course, you can become an e-member of Estonia without being a resident. What's interesting is, why is Estonia doing that? Anyone know? So, Russia hacks Estonia, who cares? Only Estonians. But if your digital identity is stored in Estonia and Russia hacks them, who cares? All of us. And that's why the most prominent person to become a resident of Estonia is, or an e-member of Estonia, is a Japanese prime minister. Because they don't like Estonia, they don't like Russia anymore. So it's an interesting play that, yes, is an interesting idea. And so if we wanted to be disruptive and we want to say, if we wanted to be disruptive, we could actually come out and say, you know, if you want to be an e-member of the United States, if you buy into what the First Amendment is, freedom of speech, freedom of symbol, freedom of the press, that would be an interesting thing, and we'd say that as a result we do the trust but verify, and maybe it also gives you faster paths to citizenship. I just raised that because Herb Simon, who I am a big fan of, for those who don't know, Herb Simon won a Nobel Prize. His background was economics, but he was also, in some cases, the godfather of artificial intelligence. His background, actually, when he did his PhD, was he actually was with New York State government, and he looked at bureaucratic decision-making. And he came to the conclusion that in New York State government, which is very much like other governments, decision makers don't go beyond what they already know. They're within this sort of like this valley, that they're not willing to go over and over the mountain to explore new places that they've never been before. And so that later led to him to do economics, behavioral economics, and eventually artificial intelligence. And so I raised that because the question is, how can we help our decision makers go beyond the valleys of things they already know to the ones that are a little bit more strange to say? Maybe we should say we're United Networks as opposed to United Nations, things like that.
Yeah.
Evolution developed us not to know, but to survive. We can survive by being stupid, we will remain stupid.
Oh, knowledge is only about...
But everything that we develop comes from the human brain. It was developed by the need to survive, not to understand reality.
So after all this is over, I'll give you my theory why the 7 deadly sins are actually evolutionary advantages to the individual. That's a different story.
So I wanted to thanks David and Jess for coming in and talking about facilitating this conversation. Please, there's food here. Grab food on your way out. Please don't leave the food here. And thank you very much for the time today.
Thanks for having us, Bill.
Thank you, Bill.